Hello, my name is Aatman Vakil. I'm a fourth year in the college, majoring in economics and music, and I'm a staff writer for the Chicago Thinker. Today it is my pleasure to interview Peter Meijer, the former representative from Michigan's 3rd District. Just to give you an introduction, Peter Meijer served as the U.S. representative from Michigan's 3rd District from 2021 to 23. Born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, he served his nation by enlisting in the Army Reserves and was deployed to Iraq in 2010 to conduct intelligence operations. He has since led humanitarian efforts in South Sudan, New York, Oklahoma, and the Philippines. He also worked with NGO in Afghanistan to provide conflict analysis to humanitarian groups serving there. Since then, he was elected to represent Michigan's 3rd District in 2020 after a highly contested primary challenge. An active legislator, he worked keenly to address issues such as human trafficking, supply chain disruptions, and veterans' health and well-being. He was defeated in re-election by a Trump-endorsed primary challenger in the 2022 election after being the only freshman congressman to vote to impeach President Trump, a president of his own party, in 2021. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Aatman, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with the Republicans here at the University of Chicago.
We are very pleased to have you. Just as a roadmap for today's interview, I will first talk about Congressman Meijer's role here as a fellow at the Institute of Politics and the seminar series he's leading here, then move on to some of the legislative work he did in Congress, talk about his experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and what foreign policy perspectives those gave him, and then finally come back to your crucial vote in the impeachment of President Trump and talk about the future of the Republican Party. Okay, so you are a fellow here at the IOP, and your weekly seminar series is titled Government Regulations and the American Dream. In it, you focus on a vast slate of state and federal regulations, and particularly how these affect cost of living issues in the US. Could you shed more light on these seminar series? What led you to come up with this topic? And then maybe moving on, which federal regulations do you view as particularly harmful and how you would address them?
Absolutely, and I just want to start off, I know we're just talking to each other, and I want to ensure everyone listening that there is a robust College Republicans at the University of Chicago. Unfortunately, my schedule didn't permit me to be able to attend when you're having your normal meetings, just because of the days that I'm here. But I've really enjoyed the chance to get to know the College Republicans here. But just to answer your question, I mean, one thing that frustrated me deeply while I was in Congress is a problem would come up, and instead of trying to understand what led to that problem, the immediate response was, we're in Congress, we need to show that we're doing something, and that something usually meant just spending more federal dollars. And now, sure, that's one way to go about things, but especially if it was not an issue of institutional capacity, if it had nothing to do with lower levels of funding than that were required, you know, it was giving the illusion and the appearance of action rather than actually trying to solve the problem. And I think back, the perfect case study of this was the Food and Drug Administration issues around the baby formula shortage back in the spring of 2021. And that was just a case study where the immediate response from the Democratic majority was, here's a bill to boost by $50 million the amount that the FDA is spending in this area. Okay, well, was it a budget shortfall? Was it a lack of funding that no, the challenge there was one of just the bureaucracy itself not being able to reconcile its responsibilities to ensure that there is safe production with also having an obligation to ensure that there is production, right? So those areas where, you know, it maybe doesn't make for as good of a bumper sticker, but if you care about government functioning properly, and I care about government functioning properly because when it doesn't function properly, it just grows bigger. It's the only institution where when it fails, it's given more power and more funding rather than understanding why it's failing to begin with. So what I wanted to try to impart on the students who were taking my seminar is to think a little bit more critically when you see a politician respond to a problem with a very simple solution, or when you see an administration respond to an issue by just proposing something that invariably spends more money and increases the size of the government without understanding whether or not that's going to be helpful in the best case, or in many cases where that just doubles down on why that problem led to it in the first case. And I say the American dream in that sense of regulation to look at those key areas. I'm looking at housing, transportation, energy, education, places where a lot of our pocketbook is dedicated to those expenses. And I'm a firm believer that the American dream means having those benefits, having those opportunities be not only within reach, but also affordable enough that you still have money to spend on things you want to do, not just things you have to do. And so looking at some of those areas where regulation has driven up costs, has reduced innovation, respecting some of the places where regulation has done a good job, right? Our FAA, when it comes to aviation safety, we have implemented a very effective system. Now there's been some issues and close calls lately, but relative to where we were 50 years ago, mortality in aviation-related accidents, I mean, is almost a non-event compared to what we were seeing prior. But then you also say, okay, let's look at what hasn't happened as well over the past 50 years, and you're looking at housing affordability, looking at education pricing. Why is it that the student to teacher ratio in higher education hasn't changed over the past 50 years? The student to administrator ratio has gone up 4 times, and over that same period, the per hour tuition has gone up 6 times. Right? So picking some of that apart, because if the response is, oh, we just need to be spending more money, well, part of the reason some of these places have gotten so, or some of these parts of our economy have gotten so unaffordable is because you have the government as an actor who is not at all price sensitive, fiddling and fixing and interfering with the basic laws of supply and demand that not only create the market on the one hand, but also hold the companies or hold the institutions in that market accountable for the quality of their product.
Absolutely. Studying economics here, something which I've learned over the 4 years of my college is that oftentimes a regulation or even a tax or a fee does not only distort the market for which it is intended, but it also distorts all these other neighboring markets. And I think that's especially true when you're talking about regulations at a federal level, because the scope for distortions getting out of control is just so much higher. And you see that in countries across the world, right? Like, especially over the last 50 years, when many places across the world have been coming out of that regulatory administrative state, cutting regulations, allowing even more foreign investment in. I believe it's also prevalent to some extent in different states across the US, where you typically see that common incentive states use to attract companies to set up shop in that state is cutting all sorts of regulations. But again, as you said, it's all about the balance, right? Because you still need to ensure some level of standards or consumer protection through a series of stable regulations without completely strangling the free enterprise system, which I think this country was founded upon.
Well, and frankly, a lot of this is it's not political. I mean, it may be political in the sense that, generally speaking, Democrats want to expand government. They want government to be larger. They want government to have more power because a lot of their core constituencies benefit from government largesse, and Republicans are more the opposite. But when it comes to things where we say, okay, listen, we think that government should do this, it's incumbent on elected officials and frankly, engaged citizens to demand that the government then do it well. I think of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden signed into law 2 years ago, which, to be clear, I didn't support, and I didn't support exactly for the reason I'm about to mention. It increased funding in a lot of these areas. It generally is just a 20% across the board increase in infrastructure spending. Okay, some of those areas maybe our spending was out of whack with where price inflation had been, but it increased the spending, but did nothing to allow states to spend that more efficiently, did nothing to decrease some of the cost drivers that have led to those being unaffordable or led to those price increases in the first place. And so that 20% increase just in spending that the federal government was sending back to the states, that 20% increase led to a 20% increase in those costs. So we wound up in the exact same place. So if we can't even get out of our own way when it comes to infrastructure, when some of the larger projects that have broad bipartisan support can't be built because of some of the federal permitting and regulatory statutes we have on the books, when our government is preventing us from, when the government's preventing the government from doing things the government wants to do that the people support it doing, we have a problem.
Absolutely. And so moving on that note, to some of the work you did in Congress, you of course were in the minority party, the Republican Party was in the minority in the Congress
I hear from my colleagues it's a lot more fun to be in the majority right now.
I can imagine. Just going over some of those policy issues you worked on then, you came in the time of a heightened economic crisis because of the COVID pandemic and the responses which had to be taken accordingly. What was your chief goal coming in when you were sworn in 2021? How did you work being in the minority with people in the majority, Democrats across the aisle, to get legislation across?
Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to know being in the minority is the majority doesn't need your vote, right? Because the body operates on a simple majority. Now, there are places where I may try to sway opinions or get a co-sponsor on something that can help blunt a bill that's coming out. One of the first things our team tried to do, and this was crazy ambitious, and we knew it wasn't going to work, but we thought it was worth trying anyways, was to have an alternative to the American Rescue Plan that could have been, frankly, $1 trillion less. It could have had much larger individual checks and cut down on a lot of the massive amount of state and local aid that had been initially needed when states and municipalities that had income tax as part of their funding stream, because of work from home and some of those other shifts that had occurred, they were anticipating on having severe budget shortfalls, right? So the part of that American Rescue Plan was supposed to plug some of those gaps. Now, what happened is, yes, some income tax shifted around. Sales taxes went up because we had a lot of people spending a lot of money both on the stimulus and on the extended federal unemployment insurance. And so the places that were anticipating a shortfall, if they had one, it was very small. And most places, I mean, California thought they were going to have something on the order of a $100 billion shortfall. They ended up having a surplus, right? So I was trying to cut out that component, increase the populace more, the direct cash, because if the government's going to spend money, I'd rather just give it to people than funnel it down through inefficient bureaucratic apparatuses. And we tried to drive that forward as an alternative. I called it the Doge plan. Give it a little bit of a meme vibe, direct dollars over government excess. Had a Democratic member of Congress who was interested in introducing it, templated off of something Susan Collins was working in the Senate. But with my goal, they were saying, listen, this isn't something I would love to see happen, all things being equal. But if this other thing is going to happen, I would rather the less bad alternative come. Challenge I faced is our leadership at the time was more concerned about, I think Dr. Seuss was being canceled because of green eggs and ham. So you had these sort of two things where we have a $1.9 trillion spending package that were given kind of that because it was going to go through budget reconciliation, we weren't actually fighting it, right? We were just kind of talking to our own audience, but doing nothing to try to get some of the more squeamish Democrats, because Pelosi had a 5-seat majority, get some of the squeamish Democrats to back away from it, maybe offer an alternative that may be more palatable to Sinema or Manchin, or maybe could have bipartisan support. If I can't stop the train, I'd rather put it onto a different track. So that was what we started to do. And I think, like many folks who run for office, I didn't go in thinking Washington was well functioning. If anything, I thought it was broken, and that was one of the reasons spurring me to run. There were no areas that I thought were broken that were anything but broken, right? I was not inaccurate on that assessment. If I was inaccurate, it was just how many of those problems, when you try to decompose them, have additional problems and additional problems and additional problems underneath that also somebody is benefiting from. Or in the case of something I've been very passionate about, our authorizations for the use of military force and war powers, where Congress just doesn't really want to do its job. Or people would rather have the broken status quo stay in place, because if you try to change it, you are opening yourself up to political attacks. If you do nothing, your fingerprints are nowhere and you're not going to be held responsible. Now, I think you're responsible for both the actions you take and your inaction as well. But that was what I was also trying to do once I had a better understanding of what was truly broken, which is two things. One, within each level of our government, power going from the more accountable, more responsive, more democratic body, the legislatures, to the less accountable, less responsive executive branch, whether that's from Congress to the president or from a state legislature to a governor, trying to put them back on an even footing. And then number two, actually trying to get more things from the federal level pushed back down to the states. Because I think the only way we have our government function well is if you have accountability for decisions that are being made, and that accountability is inherently going to be simpler at a city level than at the county level than at the state, and then at the state than the federal. So practice that subsidiarity, push things down. Now those are very relatively nuanced, relatively complex things to try to communicate, to try to understand. We tried to push for that in our policy. We tried to work on some of the deregulatory components in ways that could pass through the majority. Because it can be important to maybe put out a symbolic piece of legislation just to kind of show where folks stand. My goal was, we're in the minority. It's a slim minority, but we're in the minority. We're a freshman office, so we got 2 strikes against us. How can we get the most done possible? How can I channel my time, my staff's time, not on things that will go nowhere, but either on bills that can push the ball forward, like we did with war powers and national emergency powers and arms export powers, but also in areas that we can get something to the president's desk to be signed. Mm-hmm. And we succeeded in that. I think I doubled the record for the number of bills signed into law by a freshman office in the minority.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, I'd rather be known by that than the impeachment vote, but the CNN's more interested in one than the other.
That's absolutely right. With economics, it's all a game of trade-offs and many times choosing the less worse alternative. And it sounds like the way Washington is functioning, that just becomes reinforced more and more and more, where instead of choosing alternatives up here, you're forced to choose from alternatives just because of how this entire new dimension of what is politically feasible is added in.
Yeah, if I can stop the bad thing from happening, I will take that 10 times out of 10. If it's going to happen anyways, and you don't do what you can to make it less worse, I think there's just something very cynical about that. And sometimes that's a matter of perspective and judgment. American Rescue Plan was going to pass no matter what. So there are policies that if I had my perfect world, I wouldn't be pursuing that. But if it's going to result in a better status quo than the alternative, I do think it's the obligation of folks to try to bend things into a better direction rather than just sit on the other side and complain.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, if you had a do-over, if you could just go back with the wisdom of hindsight, what would you do differently in your time in Congress?
I think one of my biggest frustrations was not feeling like I ever cracked the nut of being able to communicate effectively with folks in our district. I mean, I'll never forget that I knocked on someone's door during my second primary, and the guy's like, oh, I don't even know what you're doing over there. Like, what? I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I'm on the local news at least once a week. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Twitter. I have an email newsletter that reached, 25% of the district, and 10% of the district opened it. Or I mean, we had incredibly high rates of that. We're sending out, letters talking about things. We're doing telephone town halls. I'm out at events, but I have to a member of Congress or any elected official it's not just enough to do something. You need to figure out how you can actually get it in front of somebody as well. And when you have, when you're competing with, I can be on Facebook. Well, my kind of more boring post may not rise to the top. It may not get the virality of something else. Trying to figure out how to convey relatively complex things and get them to a point where they're accessible. I never really felt like we cracked that nut, and mm-hmm. that frustrates me because, in the absence of that, there's a lot of issues that are not a yes or no, but or black or white. They live somewhere in that gray. I think sometimes reducing it all to black and white is both dishonest and does a disservice to helping people understand what their government actually does.
And with that, I want to move on to our next segment, which is focused on foreign policy. And you
Boy,
entered
how much time do you have for that one?
We can talk forever. I want to zoom back to Afghanistan. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan took place a few months into your first term, and that withdrawal was executed on many counts very poorly. We all saw those videos of Afghan allies and in some cases US citizens as well trying to flee the Taliban by clinging on to airplanes taking off from that narrow strip in Kabul airport. We heard about how Bagram Air Force Base was abandoned in the middle of the night. Having worked in Afghanistan, what was going on in your mind when you saw those images?
Let me step back. I was an aid worker and conflict analyst, and in Afghanistan for close to 2 years, from December of 2013 to June of 2015, and I had a relatively unique perspective because I wasn't living, on a base. I wasn't living in some really large compound. I was kind of living by myself in Kandahar City, which was not something. I think there were 2 other Westerners who kind of did that, right? So I had a very different vantage point, a different understanding. I didn't look at it as a combatant, but as somebody who had a much more nuanced understanding of the broader dynamics of the conflict. I fully supported President Trump's withdrawal proposal and his efforts to pursue the Doha Agreement in 2020 and otherwise find a political solution to that conflict. Probably I can quibble with some parts of the Doha Agreement, but by and large, I think that was a very positive effort. And what has frustrated me in Congress is that, Republicans all want to blame Biden for, the decision to withdraw. Democrats all want to blame Trump for the Doha Agreement and basically tying Biden's hands. The reality is I support the withdrawal under Trump. I support the withdrawal under Biden. The execution of that withdrawal under Biden, especially the sort of damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead, and just ignoring how things were playing out on the ground, I thought was unconscionable. Right? But stepping back, April of 2021, Biden announces that September 11th is going to be the withdrawal date, later moved up to August 31st. He announces that. I was very involved with the Special Immigrant Visa Program, for our Afghan allies who had worked alongside us. Presidents had kind of neglected that program. Republican and Democratic presidents didn't really do too much around it. But now that we had a defined end date, I thought it was imperative that we do right by those we had made promises and had obligations to. And so we had a small working group to try to tackle any legislative hurdles that existed. And the White House said, listen, we're having issues with the visa cap over here. We're having issues with the medical interview, having to extend those expiration dates because of processing delays. We said, listen, let us know what you need to do to get this job. We'll get it done. And it was some of the most kind of bipartisan and very kind of behind the scenes. But we just consistently passed the legislation we needed to do to evacuate the people we needed to. Because I was worried about just that scenario. I thought it was unlikely, but if it's a worst case scenario, you don't say, well, there's only a 10% chance. You say, okay, well, if that happens, let's make sure our bases are covered. And what grew increasingly frustrating for me over the course of the spring and summer was how the administration focused on the perfect process on the evacuation side, and then really only started it at the end of July, and then Kabul fell 2 weeks later. Once things started to fall apart, again, remember, I'm a conflict analyst. Most of my experience was in Afghanistan. I did similar things in Iraq, but I didn't have nearly the vantage and understanding I did in Afghanistan. And I also had friends all throughout the country. I had friends all throughout, some of those places that I was keeping in close contact with, and saw just an administration that wanted to be done with Afghanistan. They wanted to leave it in the rear view, thought, listen, this is never going to end well, so we'll just speed bump past it. But you can't speed bump past images of folks clinging and falling to their death off the side of C-17s. You can't speed bump past 13 service members being killed in a ISIS, Islamic State of Khorasan suicide attack. And you also can't speed bump past leaving a country in the rear view that after 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, we had all that sacrifice and investment because there was a state collapse that resulted in a fertile ground for transnational terrorist groups to train, organize, and attack the homeland. And so I'm also passionate that we can't let that same thing happen now. And so I'm still engaged on Afghanistan and trying to get that into a better place. But I will be perfectly honest. I mean, when Kabul fell, I mean, it was a gut punch like I've never felt. And I went, I was in active communication with, a lot of veterans were in a similar position I was, where we essentially lived on Kabul time. Now, this took place during our August recess, and so, I think Kabul fell on a Sunday morning, U.S. time, when Ghani fled. Sunday evening, our team, had a conference call, and I said, I know you guys are all kind of, that's the recess period. It's supposed to be, a time for, people to take a vacation, something else. Like, this is the one little window. Our team just turned out a dime and became one of the focal points for processing evacuation requests, and embedded some of the groups that were taking the hundreds of thousands of people who were reaching out, trying to prioritize and triage, if someone had a request, making sure it gets in, but also if there were requests where, this person was going to be killed for sure if they didn't get out, making sure we elevated the highest priority ones, using all of the relationships that I had, using all of the contacts that we had, using all of the groups and allies that we were working alongside who really did the heavy lifting. But that was just a horrific blur, because you knew, there was basically 2 weeks for you to do something, and then once those 2 weeks were up, that was over. But I was initially very concerned that that time frame would be insufficient for us to evacuate the people we needed to evacuate, and that we needed to try to buy more time, that the administration was unwilling to extend past that, but because they just wanted to leave it in the rear view. And so Seth Moulton and I, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, went over kind of secretly, publicly, but also without the administration or U.S. government's knowledge, partially because we were just being lied to about what was occurring. Or we were getting, maybe that's, lying implies someone was intentionally deceiving. We were not getting an accurate picture of what was occurring. It was very obtuse, it was very diffuse, it was very difficult for us to be able to do our jobs, while the administration is, in the best case, struggling, but some places, State Department says, here's an email inbox to send evacuation requests. Very quickly, that email inbox is full and bouncing those requests back, right? It was very unsatisfying. And so we went over there and were able to connect with some folks, were able to better understand that scenario, actually changed our minds on extending that date when we were on the ground, because of the fact that the Taliban were not confident that they could communicate to their lower level troops, and that everyone knew the August 31st date. If Americans are still there afterwards, there was the potential for violence between the U.S. and the Taliban. So that it was just I can't speak enough about just what an absolutely surreal experience that was, going back to an airport that I'd flown through several dozen times as a civilian, that is now abandoned and not overrun, but abandoned, and seeing Marines having to wade into these crazy crowds to pull people out who needed to be evacuated. But it really drove home to me something that really also inspired me to run, which was my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and feeling like what the U.S. does, but also what we don't do, lives hang in the balance around the globe. And the first job of a member of Congress is not foreign policy, but I think it's also important that we understand both the limitations of what we can do, but also what happens when the U.S. leaves a vacuum and countries like Russia or China or terrorist organizations step into that midst. Because I would much rather I felt burned by my experiences in Iraq. I'm very aware of the limitations of us trying to project force, but I've also seen plenty of places where for just where the U.S. doesn't need to even send anybody. They just need to not forget about the place, right? They need to have a broad attention, especially in diplomatic and international relations, because if we are asleep at that switch, it may be something we think we don't need to pay attention about now, but I would much rather we be paying the attention we need to so we don't have another 9/11, so we don't have to have blood and treasure sacrificed down the line to make those investments today to avoid those negative, horrific outcomes tomorrow.
Speaking of Russia and China stepping up, just earlier this week we saw Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meet in Moscow. Are we seeing the formulation of a new axis of evil? Is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which again kept you busy in your term? You had a lot of foreign policy disasters going on in the world in those 2 years.
Kept us busy for sure. It was fun, yeah.
Is that invasion like more than a territorial dispute? Like, how did it come across? Was it preventable?
So I also have a little bit of a unique perspective on Ukraine. I had spent a couple of weeks there in 2015 with some friends who were war correspondents right after I left Afghanistan. And we went to Mariupol, which is, well, at that point was 10 kilometers from the line between, government-controlled Ukrainian parts of the Donbass and the parts that had been under, essentially annexed or seized by Russian-backed separatist groups. And so that was a very bizarre and surreal experience. And then also spent some time in Kyiv on that same trip. But, and now seeing Mariupol as a city that's, kind of up there with Leningrad as being just a place utterly decimated from artillery strikes and airstrikes. I think we should always be wary about the potential for escalation. At the same time, I think we have sometimes allowed that fear of escalation to allow an adversary to dictate our actions. Long before Biden was squeamish about giving lethal weapons to Ukrainians, Obama was squeamish about giving lethal weapons to the Ukrainian government at the time. In hindsight, I don't know. I'm sure there are other things we could have done. I don't know what would have made the difference. And I do give the Biden administration a lot of credit for the way they rapidly declassified a lot of the pretenses that Putin was trying to use in late 2021 and early 2022 of trying to fabricate an excuse for him to go and invade. Similar to the apartment bombings that were the predicate for the second Chechen war. He was trying to kind of create that pretense, and we essentially embarrassed him on the international stage and then he just went ahead and just did it anyway. So I'm not sure what could have dissuaded him. We obviously could have supplied more quickly, and I worked, and this was a very kind of bipartisan kind of effort to work quickly to say, whatever, hoops we have to jump through, whatever bureaucratic loopholes, we need to not be moving at the speed of bureaucracy, but at the speed of war to supply some of these defensive weapons. At the same time, I was trying to back some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who wanted the U.S. to impose a no-fly zone, to which I said, absolutely not. That is a bad idea. We should not have U.S. forces directly involved in it. And so I'm, in a lot of these places, too hawkish for the doves, too dovish for the hawks, but I hopefully think arrive at a sensible and defensible place for us to be. When it comes to the Chinese-Russian dynamic, though, I think an Economist cover from very early on put it best, where Xi Jinping is sort of the Pooh Bear, and a Russian, Putin is the Russian bear sitting on his lap. Russia is an economic power. I mean, their GDP is the size of Spain. China has the second largest GDP in the world. Right? This is not at all comparable in terms of what they can do. Russia has energy that China needs. China has money and some technological capacities that Russia needs. At the end of the day, I think that this has been a massive failure on Putin's behalf. I think it has also pissed off Xi Jinping, because the last international trip Putin made before he invaded Ukraine was going to the Beijing Olympics. What was it? Maybe it was the Winter. It was the Winter Olympics.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So I forget where those were held in China. But he was going there, sitting next to him, and basically saying, at least the readouts that have been in the media, that he said he wasn't going to attack. That, what are you crazy? No, I'm not going to. And then the next week does it. And so I think China's in a position where there are ways in which Russia can be helpful to them, especially if it's a dependent, almost vassal state relative to China. If they want to have a Russian colony, that can be to their benefit. And it's probably nice from a world historical standpoint, given how China has often been, subject to others' power and now able to lever their own. But when it comes to the actual, to that axis, I think, and I hope that China looks at Russia as a sinking, as an anchor, as something that is going to drag them down in the long term. Because if we have a growth of groups that are hostile to essentially an open world and want people to choose their side, not as the U.S. as I think the U.S. should be, and I think we act in many places, though we haven't always, but to say, no, to be on the side of the U.S. and the side of the West is to be on the side of being able to determine your own destiny, rather than being forced to pledge loyalty or to be a slave of another country, as China often does, whether through coercive economic ties, like their Belt and Road Initiative throughout Central Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, and Oceania, whether it's through that, whether it is through their territorial expansion throughout the South Pacific or throughout the Pacific Ocean, and kind of stretching into the Spratlys, into territory claimed by the Philippines and Japan and others, and Taiwan. But I want us to not lose sight of the larger competition, but also be mindful that we can change our domestic opinions from time to time. The decisions we make in the international realm, we can't afford to wake up in 2 years and say, oh man, well, yeah, we probably should have done that. Like, we need to be thinking in terms of decades, and even in terms of centuries, not in terms of the 2, 4, 6-year election cycles that so much of our domestic politics is consumed by.
And now we move on to the last segment of this interview, which is coming back to domestic politics. Again, you were the first freshman to impeach a president of your own party, a moniker which has just stuck by you.
I never knew I set that record until like a year later. I read it somewhere and I was like, oh, okay. Not what I run for Congress to try to do.
What were your thoughts when, especially after January 6th, and when the impeachment proceedings kicked off? How did you reach this conclusion that impeachment was the path ahead, and do you still stand by it?
Yeah, I grew up watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart back when it was kind of funny. I mean, it was still liberal, but he was at least mocking Democrats sometimes too. And there was a lot of times where he would play a clip of, it didn't matter if they were Democrat or Republican, they would be passionately advocating for something when it was their guy doing it, and passionately protesting the exact same thing when it was the other party doing it. I think that hypocrisy, that situational ethics, is corrosive, and one of the reasons why people have lost so much faith in our politics. And so I looked at that and said, well, I was a little offended as somebody who was trying to do their job that a mob is going to be sicked on us and kind of run us out of the building. And I also think when people start dying, that's when rhetoric stops being rhetoric, and you should say, okay, this is bad, right? We agree it's bad. We did back then. But we should not be tolerating this. And the fact of the matter was, if it had been a Democratic president who had done the same thing, we'd be calling for that person to get sent to Guantanamo Bay or call him a terrorist. And so if you were going to absolutely eviscerate and criticize the other party if they did it, you probably shouldn't look the other way and excuse it when it's on your own side. Combined with the fact that I think there's fewer things that are more Republican than just not being pro-mob. Because if we get to a point where everything is mob politics, we're going to lose that. We don't have the mob, right? Republicans are not mob people, by and large. They work. They have other productive things to do with their time. hold them accountable and put them in jail when they do it. But like the Democrats are the party of sort of mobs and of those groups. We should not either say, well, they got to do that over the summer, so now we can do it in January, which I heard from some people. If you say it's bad, you shouldn't say it was bad when they do it, so that gives us the authority or the right to be as bad. So there was a lot of bad faith all around, and I just was frankly sickened by the whole thing. And I was also sickened by the fact that I had a lot of colleagues who would tell me how disgusted they were, tell me how sickened they were, tell me how abhorrent and atrocious, and this should never happen again, and then go on TV and downplay and minimize and say the exact opposite. And I didn't want to be that person. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'm sure I've been recorded behind the scenes. I probably swear more if you catch me on a hot mic, or if somebody secretly records me. But you're not going to find me saying two different things. You're not going to find me talking out of both sides of my mouth. And I think that's something that's important to me and important to our politics. So when it came to cast that vote, I couldn't find, there are maybe ways I wish the articles would have been drafted in a different way, but I couldn't look at that and say that it was inaccurate to what had occurred.
Mm-hmm. And there were, I believe, 10 other Republicans who voted to impeach.
Yeah, 10 of us. There were nine
other Republicans
on the House side, yeah.
in the House. Two of the most prominent of those 10 have been Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Would you say that the path they have taken since impeachment has been very different than the path you have taken yourself?
We've certainly taken different paths, and I don't want to speak on their path kind of one way or the other. I think every member is going to approach something from their own vantage. My goal has been, and I understand this challenge. I've seen a lot of my colleagues, sometimes the most uncomfortable place to be is to be on a side saying things to your own side, and then also, but then consistently also saying the things you believe about the other side. That can be the worst place to be because, you end
up being hated by everyone.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I was kind of joking earlier. Like, I'm pretty sure some of the people who hate me the most are like Lincoln Project people because I'm not their huckleberry. I'm not going to forswear everything else I believe or just make my life about Donald Trump. I thought January 6th was bad. I voted accordingly. Like, that is not what I put as the first word of my bio. That's not how I'm Peter Meijer. Like that was a vote on a day. Now, obviously, it was a momentous vote. It was a vote that I have plenty of former folks who said, "Oh, I would have voted that way too if I were in office." I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I've heard of that a lot. But that is one part. Our country has bigger issues to deal with. The Republican Party has bigger challenges that we have to overcome, and we need to be focused on figuring out how we can effectively implement policy and not, frankly, fall into the traps that the Democrats keep setting and that we're more than happy to walk into.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of political futures, 2024 looms right ahead. We just saw in a series of Truth Social posts on one side and a recent interview with the British journalist Piers Morgan on another side, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis clash with each other, lock horns for the first time with the impending primary. We also have other candidates like Nikki Haley in the race. Who is best placed out of all these candidates to defeat Biden, and what do you think this upcoming primary clash is going to look like?
I think it'll be very entertaining. I think if there's one thing you can rely on, it will not be a boring event. I mean, the reality is, Biden is our oldest president, and he is old, and he shows it. Trump is our second oldest president, and he would be older on the first day of his second non-consecutive term than Ronald Reagan was when he left office. Right? So we're talking about two very old guys, right? Like, there are just things that may naturally happen because you have very, very elderly folks in this dynamic that could completely change the apple cart, right? So I say that to mean I really don't want to get into long-term projections because it's still very far away. And if I've learned one thing, whatever you think is going to happen, whatever happens is probably going to be dumber than you thought it was, and probably a little bit more anticlimactic, but still entertaining along the way. It's not going to be massively theatrical. It's not going to be a narrative tied up in a bow. It'll probably be really, really stupid. But I think I've been very impressed by Governor DeSantis and the way he's handled Florida, and also the way that he has, there's certainly policies and approaches he's taken that I don't love, that I look at and say, I'm not sure if I agree with that. But even in those places where I don't necessarily agree, I still understand why he's doing it, and I still actually kind of respect where that's coming from and what he's trying to accomplish. I'm not a fan. I don't like the idea of, well, the Democrats are using state power to go after their enemies, so we should do the same. I don't like that. But if you're fighting from a defensive position and you are trying to get institutions like a corporation that has gone into one camp because that camp has attacked them and brought them in because of that pressure, if you offer counterbalancing pressure to get them back to neutral, I think those means justify the end. Right? And so I've been impressed at the way he has done all that. And obviously I haven't seen as much of what Nikki Haley's campaign has kind of been comprised of, and I've met Vivek Ramaswamy, he's come to some Republican events, and I think he has an important message to talk about, especially when it comes to the financial implications of some of the ESG components, because that has an impact on high energy prices, because oil companies, have seen their stock go down, and then Wall Street analysts say, well, now we need you to, focus on no more capital expenditures. We want you to focus on dividends and buybacks, right? There are all these unintended consequences from dumb bumper sticker slogans coming from the left, and I think he's doing a good job illustrating that. I will say, if it is Biden versus Trump in 2024, it just seems like a really depressing prospect for the country that neither party can kind of shake off, or I shouldn't say shake off, because I also, and this is what maybe the Lincoln Project people hate me for, I will say a lot of the positive things that Donald Trump brought to the Republican Party and did during his term in office. Now, I think the pre-Trump party was very moribund. It was very dull. Now, I think a lot of he shook up some things very positively, but there were also some electoral constituency swaps that I think weren't good for the Republican Party in the long term. And I worry that what he has brought to the party, a good leader makes sure that whatever that the institution they're a part of is stronger after they're gone rather than weaker. And I think he has not gone with that general vibe, but more so, the more Republicans are just attacking Republicans left, right, and center, and you see the True Social post that he puts out about Governor DeSantis, all that is oxygen that we're wasting on each other, tearing each other down, as opposed to focusing on actually getting into office and doing things, right? And what is a party for but to elect people to advance its agenda? And someone may only advance your agenda 95%, but I'd rather take 95% that actually get in office than 100% that has not a snowball's chance of winning.
Congressman Meijer, my final question to you. You charted a course for the future. Where do you fit in this? There's been lots of speculation about you running for Senate in Michigan in 2024. What is your political future?
Well, my political future for the next 4 weeks at least is continuing to have wonderful discussions with the folks here at the University of Chicago, so I couldn't be more pleased. And I will say, I went to Columbia, and I had a lot of weird interactions where, and it can be fun, it can be weirdly fun to be a conservative on a college campus, because you are very confident in what you believe, because you are continually having to defend it. But I've been impressed, not just obviously with the conservative students, but with the students writ large that I've talked to, who have approached issues in good faith, who maybe come in with preconceived notions, but are aware of that as well and want to have open and stimulating conversations. So I thank you for this time today, and it's really been an honor to spend time here at the university.
Thank you very much. That was Congressman Peter Meijer, formerly from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. And just as a disclaimer, the views in this video are not an official position taken by the Chicago Thinker. Thank you very much for joining us, Congressman.
Thank you.